I think we don't need to go too much into the background about why these skills, we're talking about 21st century skills, general capabilities in Asia Pacific. A lot of the development works naming them transversal competencies. Look, there's a lot of frameworks out there. There's a lot of terminology being used. And here I'm just highlighting a number of the frameworks that are emerging from different organisations or different education systems. Indeed, in this for Australia purposes, we can see the general capabilities at the front and left here. So really at the core of all of these different frameworks are actually a common set of skills that seem to be emerging again and again as a continuing priority. And so to us, we felt like a lot of the research was getting caught up in how do we package these skills, visually represent them, but really we realized that that was almost becoming a bit of a hurdle, that we were getting stuck on that. And what we really need to know more of in the research is what do these skills look like in the classroom and how can we enhance them? So not just what skills are of priority to us, but how can we get at those skills? And so we decided to accept that there will be different frameworks and that different organizations, countries, systems will have different priorities as to the skills that are of importance to them. But we wanted to dig a little bit deeper and try to get at what some of those skills mean in the classroom. I don't think, again, we have to reflect too much on the importance of these skills. I think by being here, you're in this presentation, you're already acknowledging that these are of particular interest. And as you said, Celia, particularly now, where we're requiring students to really apply their skills more than ever. And this is quite an outdated graph I've been showing for some time, but the trend continues in the demands from an employability perspective. The employment sector is continuing to look for students who collaborate well with others, who can think critically, who can be creative. And that's because the types of jobs that are emerging now in the most recent decades have become non-routine occupations, and they require much more critical thought processes rather than just routine manual labor type skills. So from an employability perspective, these skills are more and more in demand. From an educational, international, global perspective, these are also of importance. We talk about the Sustainable Development Goals for 2030, a global agenda around trying to increase a number of different worldwide factors. But for us, most important would be the fourth Sustainable Development Goal, which is around education. And you can see 7 different agendas here around the education factor. And although the skills, specific skills aren't explicitly stated in a number of these goals, still there's a nuance or a nod towards the fact that skills are inherently relevant to many of these. We can see literacy, numeracy, and technology being explicitly stated. But if we're to take the idea, and indeed a lot of the research is indicating, that applying skills such as critical, creative thinking and collaboration actually enhance students' learning in other learning domains, then indeed these skills are going to emerge more and more readily. And indeed, they will help us drive towards achieving some of these longer term global agendas. When we were thinking about which skills to focus on, I suppose we had to start somewhere. I think a lot of the national or global frameworks around what are these skills. As I said, there was a core set of skills that seemed to emerge. This is our own holistic development framework that we've developed at ACER, just to identify a number of the skills that are emerging again and again. And you can see how we've categorized them here. But what we wanted to do, as I said, was to take a deeper dive into some of these skills. So we looked for skills that can be measured, that we can monitor over time. And we looked for skills that we can have teaching interventions around that we as educators can actually have an impact on enhancing in our students. And we have thought around the different ways in which we might be able to measure some of these skills. There might be a cognitive element, some level of ability or performance that we can observe in students. But there might also be attitudes and values around particular skills that we can measure in students and in teachers. And of course, there is behavioural aspects of any skill that we can observe and judge. So we ended up narrowing it down to 3 skills through one of our internally funded projects. This was called the General Capabilities Assessment Project. General capabilities being the term that we've adopted in Australia. We narrowed it down to critical thinking, creative thinking, and collaboration. Again, these seem to be very commonly appearing in each and every framework, but also some of the preliminary research we did in Australia with teachers was indicating that teachers already felt they were embedding these skills to some extent in the classroom, and that it might be a good place to start to unpack these skills more. We had a certain understanding, at least a baseline understanding of what these skills meant, and we weren't just introducing a new skill that we'd never heard of before. In our project, we wanted to conceptualize what progress would actually look like in these skills and how we could actually begin to assess against levels of proficiency. So taking a very, very formative approach to thinking about assessment, we weren't wanting to provide scores against these skills, but instead be able to track and monitor the processes that students went through to get to that end result. So we're thinking about assessment here, we're thinking about the journey that students go on to reach an end goal, rather than just thinking about an end product or an end answer that they might achieve. In our project, we're taking a very classroom focused perspective on these skills at present. And we're thinking about using classroom-based problem-solving activities to really hone in on these 3 skills. In this particular research I'll talk about, we focused on year 5 and year 8 primarily. We have some other age groups involved, but it's almost about starting somewhere. Start with 3 skills, 2 age groups, and some in between. And we start to apply this approach with the idea that then we can scale it up to involve other skills. So now that this part of the research is complete, we've began applying this exact same approach with 3 new skills. Another part that we really felt was missing from this area was around teacher resourcing. So particularly in Australia, we have fantastic documentation which outlines our agenda around the general capabilities. It's well documented where we're expected to teach and assess the skills in the curriculum, but it doesn't necessarily connect or translate to classroom practice. Teachers don't feel like they've got enough resources to actually implement the teaching and assessing, and there's no formal national reporting practices around the general capabilities. So as I say, we're focusing on these 3 skills, but it is a scalable approach that we're now then applying up, so that from our holistic development framework, we start to fill a lot of those gaps so we can build a much bigger picture as we progress. There was really 3 evident needs that came out of our preliminary research. The first, in terms of 21st century skills, the first was to actually understand the skills at a detailed level and to understand development in these skills. And the way that we have addressed that is to develop skill development frameworks, which Celia mentioned before, and I'll go into in a bit more detail next. The next need was to monitor growth. If we're trying to enhance these skills, then we need to identify where students are currently at, and we need tools and measures that we can implement to actually be able to then monitor them over time. And to address this need, we developed skill development levels, and for want of a better term, they're learning progressions that you can use to you can use as a tool to monitor and track where students are at in their development of these 3 skills. And finally, the third need was to ensure alignment in curriculum, assessment, and pedagogy. And of course, we know in any education system, the expectation is there that we would have alignment between these 3 components. And we're seeing it as being no exception, that the same shouldn't happen with the skills. We are taking the perspective that in order to be sustainable and an accessible approach in reality, the skills should really be embedded into existing practice and not just an additional layer of complication or documentation that teachers now have to be overburdened with. And so that relates to the approach that we have here in Australia, where the general capabilities are seen to be intertwined with the key learning areas. So for us, it's about embedding the skills into existing learning outcomes for key learning areas, for embedding them into assessment measures, and for embedding them into teaching strategies. Of course, I'll down the track here, I'll get to the complications of doing that. We're not saying that every skill needs to go into every learning area or with equal measure. Of course, some skills are more amenable to particular learning areas. Critical thinking in science, for example, would be something that is already very explicitly there. But although I'm saying we're thinking about applying critical thinking in science and critical thinking in history, we still need a foundation for understanding critical thinking and the other skills. So we came up with these frameworks. I say came up like it was a very simple task, but indeed these required quite a lot of extensive research. What we're trying to do here is break the skills down into manageable chunks, into natural divisions of sub-skills or aspects, as we're calling them. You can see the example of creative thinking here, where we've divided it into 3 strands, and then the strands subsequently break down into aspects. This is a way of conceptualizing the skill that then can form the basis for everything that comes beyond that. So what I mean by that is that we actually use the aspects to write assessment items. We use the aspects to embed into lesson plans. Rather than saying, today we're going to teach creative thinking, instead we would say, okay, today I'm going to teach my students how to think of novel ideas, or I'm going to teach my students to think of a range of ideas. And the research we've been undertaking is showing that it's much easier to apply this methodology than trying to cover the entirety of a construct or a skill all at once. And of course, our initial reaction was, and yours might be too at this point, that this is a lot for people to digest. And indeed, we've got 3 of these and potentially more coming. But in fact, when teachers start to get into to break it down and to pick off pieces of this, it actually ends up being much more manageable. We're thinking about, in embedding 1 or 2 of these aspects at any one time, with them then becoming more natural in being more naturally adopted in the classroom before you pick up another couple. And so teachers are building their understanding of the skills gradually and embedding them gradually before they're building up this bigger picture. I'm not going too much into detail about the definitions themselves because the documentation is there, but I'm happy to respond to any specific questions about them. Here I'm just showing you again, and I should say it was completely coincidental that all 3 skills broke down into 3 different strands. Indeed, we conceived these independently of one another. So the idea here then is that we have generic definitions of the skills. So regardless of which learning area you're in, what a good critical thinker is and what the elements or aspects of a critical thinker is the same. How a student applies their critical thinking skills may be dependent on the learning area that they're in, because you've got the complexity of their subject matter knowledge. So if a student has quite good science skills, they might be able to apply their critical thinking skills more readily. Whereas if they struggle in history, they might not be able to get to grips with the content as well. But the idea is that by enhancing their critical thinking skills, this might provide them an opportunity or a benefit in actually learning that content knowledge as well. So we're hoping that these frameworks actually provide a common terminology for not just for systems to use, but for teachers to use and for students and parents to use too. From the teacher perspective, if we're all using the same framework to discuss and describe the skills in school, then we are all on the same page. We're all able to converse around it, and we open up a dialogue that seems fairly familiar to us. Similarly, when we're talking with parents and students, we can actually begin to bring them in to the conversation. And this lays out very clearly our expectations for students around the skills, something that we found as a hindrance in a lot of the evidence we're finding is that students aren't being explicitly taught the skills. When students go into a science classroom, they know they're going to be learning science content. They don't necessarily know that they're being taught critical thinking or creative thinking skills. And so one of the things that we're advocating for is that explicitness, bringing students in to have some advocacy and agency for their own skill development, we're finding is a lot more beneficial. In sharing these frameworks to some extent with students, we're able to bring them into that terminology space. We're able to show them what our expectations are of them in regards to developing their collaboration skills or their critical thinking skills. Similarly, those learning progressions that I spoke about, teachers are using those they're using versions of those with students to have students identify themselves. And so what we're now doing is building metacognitive understanding within students about their own skill abilities. Just some information now about our particular assessment that we've just developed. So we work with a number of countries internationally in building assessments, but in applying these frameworks too. There's a number of countries internationally that we've provided these to and helped them build into their education system now. But internally in our organization, we wanted to test out whether we could actually measure all three of these skills together. And so we've worked on this particular assessment just of our own accord, and we rolled it out over the last 3 years across schools in Australia. So I just wanted to give you an idea of, we've got these definitions, but how does this apply in a particular assessment that we've developed? The assessment is a lengthy one. It's intended as a problem-based learning module or unit of work, rather than just something a student sits in front of them, completes, and we move on. It's intended to last about 5 or 6 hours over a period of time. So a problem-based learning approach with about 10 tasks, and some elements are online and some are face-to-face. Some of the tasks are individual and some are group work. We thought that problem-based learning is not the only way in which we see these skills being assessed. We've got a number of different types of assessments, but we found that as an entry point, the PBL unit really lends itself well to measuring these three skills. That's because in the PBL unit, students need to think critically about information and ideas that are presented to them. They need to think creatively about the problem presented to them. And they also, for some of the tasks, need to work collaboratively to find the best solution. So the PBL is really setting us up well for trying to integrate measures of these three skills. This is just the idea of a template. So what we've built is actually the bones of an assessment for measuring these three skills. And the idea is that teachers can plug and play in the problem-based learning context that's relevant for them. So again, if you're a history teacher and you're coming up to a particular topic in the curriculum, you can build a problem-based scenario around that and plug it into our assessment template. Similarly, if you're in geography, you can plug and play a related curriculum topic into there. And the idea is that although they're curriculum-orientated problems, that's to say, they have relevance to the curriculum, that allows some level of sustainability over time because you're connecting it to what else is happening in the curriculum. The actual assessment itself doesn't require any prerequisite knowledge of the subject matter. So really what we're getting at here is we're measuring the skills rather than that subject matter. And for us, that was quite important, given that that's where we're trying to build up our understanding of the evidence that can be demonstrated around these skills. We developed two versions of the assessment. One was a humanities module, which was around refugee resettlement, and another was around STEM-based approach, which was around building a sculpture. So the exact same model is applied to both of those different problem-based scenarios. Don't worry about reading the entirety of this, but this is just to give you an idea of the task flow. So we followed a particular problem-based learning model where students have to understand the problem, generate ideas, further investigate, improve, and then communicate their solutions. And you can see we have 10 tasks that relate to each of those stages of the problem-solving module. And then here we have each of the skills that primarily we're measuring in each of those. So the idea is that this template will stay static, and we have assessment rubrics underpinning each of these tasks so that regardless of that problem-based scenario that is overlaying the top, the tasks and the assessment rubrics would stay the same. I just wanted to give you one idea. I know this presentation was quite interested in creativity or creative thinking. So I just wanted to give you one example of one of those tasks to give you an idea of how we're actually getting at some of these aspects in the framework. So this is the third task in our assessment measure, which measures creative thinking. And by this point in the task, students have been presented with an FAQ. They've had to do a little bit of research around, sorry, I should state the problem. The problem scenario is refugee resettlement. And so the idea is that there's a suburb in Australia where a number of refugees have been placed, and it's asking the students as part of the community to come up with the best ways of integrating the refugees into the community. So students have addressed a number of FAQs, they've gone about doing their own research, and at this point of the task, they're now asked to generate a number of ideas for community action project. I'll show you a couple of student responses to give you an idea of the measures. So this is an example from student A. They actually didn't perform very well on this task, and I'll outlay why. So in the brackets here is the aspects that we link these measures to in the framework. So a number of ideas being the first aspect of creative thinking. And we can see here that they only came up with 4 ideas. So they scored quite low in that sense. The second aspect in the framework is range of ideas. And again, here we can see that actually there's not a great deal of range either. All of these ideas is about provision. They're giving something, they're giving away free essentials. It's money, food, clothing, education. So it's all the same type of idea. The next aspect is about shifting perspective, being able to see beyond your own perspective of a problem. And we can again see here that there's quite limited consideration. They're only thinking about the refugees' perspective. Novelty is another one. I should state that when we talk about creative thinking, we talk about novelty relative to the students in question. So what might be novel to a grade 5 student is different than what's novel to a year 8 student. While there's a place for pure novelty or innovation, as we might call it in this conversation, when we're scoring for novelty, it's relative. So we're not talking here about students coming up with the most novel concept that's never been thought of before, but only one that would appear to be novel to them outside of their typical thinking space. And here, most ideas are not strikingly original. Most ideas are quite naive, so we're looking at fitness for purpose here. There's not really going to be much of an impact by giving refugees a piece of fruit every day, for example. And finally, there's not much elaboration. The quite short responses, there's not much elaboration on how this would actually be undertaken. By comparison, we can see student B here, they have performed much better. There's 7 or 8 distinct and quite coherent ideas, so they score much higher for number of ideas. There's more diverse range of ideas. So, for example, this response here about not discriminating children at school and standing up for them if you see them getting bullied. That's now not just about giving refugees some provision or free essentials. That's in fact setting a new tone in the community. And so that would be seen as having being in a different range of contributing to a multiple range of ideas. Most ideas, in terms of perspective taking, most ideas here consider the needs of the refugees, but also they take the perspective of the community. So here we can see, let's have a welcome party to welcome them into the community. And again, this idea here that the children would take an active role from their peers' perspective, not just from the refugees' perspective. And at least one idea was quite original or novel. We can see here for the community to come together so they can explain what the refugees have been through and create a bit of awareness about what's happening in the world. So for these grade 5 or 6 students, that's a really novel idea. We can see that most ideas are clearly fit for purpose. And finally, again, this particular idea, number 7, actually elaborates. They're explaining why that this would be a good idea. So I've outlined the rubric here that you're welcome to take a screenshot of, so you can just see how we're actually turning. The point here is that you can see how we're taking the aspects in the framework, and then we're using these to build the measures for our assessments. And so we're building the rubrics up all on the basis of those particular aspects. So again, those aspects being the foundation of everything that comes after. I wanted just to touch on the concept of learning progressions. And I say touch on because there's so much I could go into here, but with limited time and so many topics to cover. But I do think it's worth touching on how we get to having a skills framework and how we would be thinking about that from a growth perspective. So typically, thinking about where learning progressions come from, typically these are actually hypothesized notions of growth over time. And that's certainly how ours started. You conceive how each of these aspects might progress, naturally increase in sophistication. And then you would typically look for empirical evidence of this. And that would come through any number of ways of observing, judging, assessing student performance. And a lot of iteration would go then into cross-checking against your hypotheses, validating that you're right, or making changes. And so we've gone through this very iterative process so that we can say to some extent that our skill development levels are validated, but validation is a continuous process. And so where we're at now, for example, in our understanding of literacy and numeracy has come from so many years of prior knowledge and building understanding. We're still quite a ways away from having that level of understanding regards to these skills. In regards to learning progressions, for example, we at ACER, we have a learning progression for literacy and numeracy, which is at least 14 levels long, so we can delineate quite clearly between 14 levels of sophistication or proficiency in students, which requires quite a lot of evidence, and it's quite granular. By comparison, at the moment, we have about 4 or 5 levels for each of these 3 skills. So we're building up that evidence, but we're not going to be pulling apart levels, digging much more granular until we have confidence that it's easy to capture those more nuanced differences between students at different levels. And again, at this point in time, we don't need to be necessarily reporting on against 14 different levels of critical thinking. Even having 3 levels I think would be beneficial, a great starting point for us. If we think about how we've been validating, I just wanted to show you an example of how we might do that. With our assessments, we use item response theory to as a psychometric analysis to check that we are indeed measuring what we think we're measuring through our assessment tasks. And this is one of the outputs on the left here that we get from that item response theory analysis. And it's called an item person map. It's basically 2 histograms vertically. The left histogram with the X's represents the students, each X representing about 6 to 10 students. And the right histogram is the items on our assessment, this particular one representing all of our critical thinking items. So what this item map is telling us is how well aligned or how well targeted our particular assessment is for our grade 8 students, which are on the left-hand side there. And you can see that the histograms are fairly well aligned, which means we gave students well-targeted assessment. So we can start to get a sense for what expectations might be of students at this particular age group. But what this also tells us is that we can see which items are of more difficulty to students. If we think about this scale, if you like, as a proxy of frequency, that being the items down the bottom are those that are most frequently responded to positively or correctly by students. So a lot of students got these items at the bottom done well. At the top, there's less frequency. Very few students actually got these items correct or responded to them well. And so we can think about this as a gradual scale of increasing difficulty in our items, as well as we think about on the left, it's an increasing scale of student proficiency. And so what we do is really interrogate this scale, to build a bigger picture about what's actually happening. So what's happening in item 12 and item 6? What are these? And you can see we've mapped these now to the aspects in our framework through these columns. We've just basically taken these items from the scale and popped them into this table so you can see how spread they are across the aspects. So in this particular assessment, we're measuring 6 aspects of critical thinking. Only 1 item for the first aspect, but several more items for the second aspect, and so on. But we can start to actually look at what are we asking students to demonstrate in these items, and what does that tell us about what level students could be at. When we think about our collaborative tasks, for example, just basic communication would be conceived as being quite low. And at a slightly higher level, perhaps facilitating communication between and amongst students would be conceived as quite high. So you can hypothesize these things, but when you start to see them coming out of the assessments in the order that you hypothesized, we would see that as being a validating process. And the opposite is true too, of course. If we see things that don't fit with our hypothesis, we can start to interrogate those a little bit more and find out what we were missing prior to having this type of information. What we can then do is look for natural breaks in those we can see here some sort of clusters of items together. And of course, we would know exactly what these items are, so we might be able to see some conceptual breaks too. And so then we would divide these up into levels. And then from this assessment, we can begin to place students at particular levels. We can also see here, there's some different patterns happening across the different aspects. So we wouldn't necessarily deduce this, but you can certainly see that for aspect 1.2, the way that we've measured it in this particular assessment, all of the items are quite easy. So that's around discriminating information. So we might go back to our conceptual understanding of what discriminating information means and see if we can think of a more difficult way of describing that and then building in those more difficult measures. Or indeed, it might just be that this is a fairly easy aspect to demonstrate overall, and that it doesn't get much more complex than what we're seeing here. So essentially, we wouldn't just, so what we're seeing on the left here is what we call a derived scale, which is from one single assessment. But what we're aiming for and what we're building is taking a number of these derived scales from a different number of different assessments to build up a bigger picture, which results in the learning progressions. So good learning progressions will come from a number of different derived scales over time. What I'm just showing here is a very small section of the collaboration progressions. And what I wanted to point out was that we've also tagged the aspects in the progressions so that, you know, as I say, if you're targeting at the aspect level and you're wanting to monitor, let's say you give students an assessment around aspect 1.1, which is in collaboration, which is about communicating. And students perform quite low on that, as we can see here. Then we know what to look for at the higher level for this particular aspect. And so teachers may build into their subsequent lessons strategies for building on this particular aspect. And then we can use this to monitor whether students improve up the progression over time by using these aspect levels almost as benchmarks. This was just to give you an idea of how the collaboration progression looks at a simple level. You know, at a very low level, it would just be, in terms of aspect 1.1 around communicating, it's just about students responding to others. They're not taking any initiative. At a slightly higher level, students might start to ask questions or ask for clarification. At a higher level again, students actually start to probe other students for more information or ask for justification. And at the highest level, we would see students begin to actually facilitate and maintain communication within their group. And from our particular assessment, this was the trend that we're starting to see around age-based expectations. Most of the year 10 students were fitting in this low to low mid range, and the typical 15-year-olds were low to mid to high. In terms of some of the findings, that they're all outlined in that report, so you can get more details. But you know, we were finding out some quite interesting things about each of these skills that will then, again, it's a never-ending story of iteration. We'll go back, we reviewed our conceptual frameworks and our progressions in light of the data that came out, and we were able to confirm some of those theories. I mean, the obvious one here is creative thinking. You know, coming up with multiple ideas is generally easy, but generating original or novel ideas was more difficult. So this is a very obvious one where we would hypothesize that very naturally, but you want evidence that that is the case. And so the fact that that evidence did indeed come out of our assessment not only tells us that our assessment seems to be measuring these skills well, and but that the inferences we've made about the skill are accurate. And as I say, all of this information is in the report if you're interested. I'm just moving a bit faster because of time. So with these problem-based learning modules, these seem to be, as I say, it's not the only way to assess, but it certainly seems like a great starting point in which to start to integrate some of these aspects. Interestingly for us, there wasn't a huge amount of difference between we administered the grade 5 and the grade 8 assessment, the same assessment to the grade 5 and the grade 8 students. And the interesting thing was we were able to see all of the same aspects being demonstrated by those students. So when we're saying that these are generic frameworks that go across learning areas, we're also hoping that they go across grades and that they can be applicable right across the width of our students. And indeed, we were happy to see that they were indeed applicable to grade 5s and grades 8. We get asked quite a lot about, from an Australian perspective, whether, because the general capabilities is describing creative and critical thinking as one general capability, and we're describing them as two. So we get asked about this a lot. We did conduct some factor analysis, which basically sort of throws all the items up and sees where they land. And typically when items in an assessment cluster together, that means that they're measuring the same thing. And we did 2 factor analyses, one that came out with 3 factors, one for each of those 3 skills that we were measuring. And we also had a second one that was less strong, but it was still reliable enough to mention, which was a 4-factor analysis. The first 3 factors contained items from each of those 3 skills. The 4th factor actually contained a small number of items from both critical thinking and creative thinking. So what we're deducing from that is that there is an overlap, a natural, a conceptual and a visible overlap from critical and creative thinking. But I wouldn't be surprised, I wasn't surprised about that, and I certainly wouldn't be surprised to see other low overlaps in other skill areas. If we start to think about measuring problem solving, for example, the overlap between that and critical thinking, I think, would be quite evident as well. I'm just going to pick up on one last thing, which is about the third need that I identified earlier, which was around alignment. And a lot of the work we'll be doing internationally is working with education systems to think about skills from all 3 of these components. The trend at the moment seems to be that the skills are being integrated in curriculum first, with little sort of nods to assessment. Very few countries have actually picked up on the pedagogy side of things or the teacher training side of things. And so really what we're saying is to be sufficient, to be sustainable going forward, you need to be integrating to some extent the skills into all 3 of these areas. We need to put them into the learning outcomes in the curriculum. We need to build assessment measures so we can monitor those learning outcomes in relation to the skills, but we need to be teaching teachers how to teach the skills. We need to be providing guidelines around teaching strategies that enhance the skills. And of course, we need to be thinking about what teaching resources above and beyond the key learning area resources that we have, that we can provide teachers that relate to the skills. Not a big ask at all. Again, just on how we've been doing that on the ground in relation, it comes back to the aspects. So this is creative thinking aspects 2.1, shifting perspective, 3.2, novelty. You can see here we've got the curriculum, the assessment, and the pedagogy. Just as this one is an example, we've taken these from the Australian curriculum, as it's probably most relevant here. And you can see we've got the element and the sub-element as mapped to the ACER curriculum. And then we've got assessment criteria linked to our learning progressions. And then we've got suggestions for how you might actually teach this particular aspect. So we start to package these up, and again, as I say, target an aspect or a couple of aspects at a time. Then we're really harmonizing all three of those areas. I mean, this is, you know, an outline of the dimensionality of the Australian curriculum. We know we've got a lot going on. We've got 7 general capabilities crossed with 8 learning areas, crossed with 3 cross-curriculum priorities. The point here with the empty boxes is that, you know, we don't need to be seeing every single general capability in every single learning area. And while we as a country and many other countries are trying to do everything all at once, the approach we're advocating for is that you start small with a solid approach, 1, 2, or 3 skills perhaps across 1, 2, or 3 learning areas. You build up really great competence in teaching and assessing those, and then you scale up using the same approach with different skills and additional learning areas. We're seeing this has more impact than trying to just integrate every single skill everywhere and teach everything all at once. It's maybe not such a manageable approach. And again, I mean, this is about outdated now. This is from a colleague of mine who they mapped the Australian curriculum in reference to, you know, where those overlaps are. So with the red, you're seeing a high prevalence of skill or general capability in each of the key learning areas, the darker the blue, the less prevalence. So, I mean, quite obvious ones: high literacy seen in English, high numeracy seen in maths. We might not want to see all red. I think that's the takeaway from this graph. You know, we might not want to see 90% or more prevalence of each skill in each learning area. But this sort of activity as a system can really help to identify what the priorities are, or where the really small, the small presence is for the skills. For example, there's no personal and social skills in mathematics. So perhaps by integrating more collaborative activities in mathematics, we're able to enhance students' personal social skills. I mean, as I say, I think this is a few years out of date now, but it's just to give you the conceptual idea around how we're going about this. And then very finally, one of the things that's really emerging now, and that it's really only in its infancy for us, is the idea of learner profiles. But I think the takeaways in relation to this, I would say from my presentation would be, well, what's a priority? What types of skills are you going to put in there in relation to your system level priorities? And what are your sources of evidence? How concrete are these sources of evidence? You know, is it fine just to have a student portfolio, or do you want more robust measures? Do you want teacher observations? I think all of that comes back to understanding the skills, how the skills are demonstrated, what they look like in the classroom, what the student behaviours are that are associated with the skill, how they can be enhanced by teachers, how they can grow. And then we can identify what constitutes as appropriate evidence. Finally, you know, when we think about that, we need to be reasonable with ourselves. We are, although we've made significant progress, we're still at the very start of this journey, in the sense that, you know, as I say, with other skills like literacy and numeracy, we're very far down the track in understanding what evidence of those skills look like, what a good literate student looks like versus a poor literate student. We are only beginning to understand what a good critical thinker in the classroom looks like, or a good collaborator looks like in the classroom. And the inferences that we're making are larger, or there's a bigger gap between the inference and the evidence that we have for the skills. And really, validity is just about narrowing and narrowing and narrowing that gap till we can say with a greater level of certainty that we're sure that the skill or the performance we're seeing demonstrated by students can be linked to this skill, this aspect at this level. So we're continuing, these are some of the skills that we're continuing on with now: self-regulation, empathy, civic engagement, problem solving. We do have a general capabilities newsletter that you can sign up for, and we also have Well, we've just ran the last masterclass for the year online, which was around helping you develop your own PBL model for your class. But keep an eye out if you're interested more in that, because we're always keen to run some PD or support in any way we can with your own classroom practice. And of course, Zia pointed out earlier that there's a range of resources where you can get a little bit more information into any of those particular areas that I've talked about. Sorry that was so much information in a very fast, short time. But please, I do welcome any questions, or feel free to also reach out and email me if you'd like to know more.
Thank you, Claire. Thank you. That was just wonderful to hear about and to see a little known fact is the Alivo Institute is now what was formerly known as the De Bono Institute. So when I saw the 6 thinking hats up there, I was very pleased to see that they haven't lost any of their power as a teaching tool. They're still as good and fun and easy to access for all teachers at all different levels. That was just joyous. So so this holistic framework really is surfacing the skills that can be measured through monitoring growth, and to identify skill development and build those learner profiles. So it's all making a lot of sense, Claire. And your research and your work promoting problem-based learning is inspiring. And I've always felt as a system leader, when I was working in the system for 6 years at Catholic Ed, that there was a lot more, there's a lot more we could do in that PBL space within primary school. So it's really good to hear more about it today. And the examples using the work that you use, examples of A and B, promoting teaching for novelty and innovation, that is just joyous. I loved the practical examples and the rubric across the curriculum, assessment and reporting and pedagogy to support our teachers' training. It's always something. So thank you so much. It's just been wonderful to hear those messages. For some, they're reinforcing, good practical things that we can do in the classroom, and then also at a system level and a university, tertiary education level too, to know that what we're actually all moving ahead together. So thank you so much. I really appreciate it. I'm looking, we don't seem to have any questions. So you're a very good teacher, Claire. Oh, hang on, there is one. So Soon, would you like to ask that question yourself? If you'd like to, you may pop on your camera and microphone. No? Okay. Soon has a question. To what extent has industry needs been integrated into your research?
Thanks, Soon. Yes, industry needs. You might have missed just at the start, I was talking about the demands for employability. And so most definitely what the current employability trends seem to be is three of the 5 most desired skills are the ones that we ended up targeting. Problem solving was another one. I actually can't remember the 5th one, but so employers are looking for great creative thinkers, collaborators, and critical thinkers. I think the big takeaway though is, we can all walk into an interview and say we're great collaborators, and it's not until you employ someone you realize maybe they aren't. So what we need to be building, particularly from a learner profile perspective, is solid evidence. How can we build up a portfolio of evidence so that our students can walk into a job and say, not only am I a good collaborator, but here is the evidence that I can say, I am. And whether that, I'm hoping that there's a vehicle to do that through the breakdown to those aspects. It's not just saying I'm a great collaborator, but look how I demonstrated my negotiation skills, or look how I enhanced my communication skills. And so I think building up a better understanding of the skills will lead to better evidence of the skills, or better mechanisms for demonstrating that